Wild Health is about optimizing you. We use genomics, blood work, biometrics, microbiome assessment, many other tests, and a conversation with you to come up with a full health optimization plan. What's the perfect diet, exercise, and supplement plan for you and only you? The Wild Health podcast is about optimizing all of us. Here we cover the cutting-edge science that gives you the base to be able to apply the personalized plan we give you as a patient. To sign up as a patient, go to wildhealth.com. Or if you're a physician or health coach and you want to learn how to do this for your patients, we're happy to help as well. Wildhealth.com for all the information on becoming a patient or working with us. Hey everybody, a quick note about our precision medicine training program. It's been a really popular course. We're constantly hiring health coaches and physicians, but we're only hiring them as we grow if they're trained in precision medicine. You don't get that in medical school or other places. And so we've developed this training program and we've completely revamped it recently. It's a lot more robust. So now there's still over 50 hours of live synchronous training. There's also all the asynchronous credit, over 50 hours of content. And as a physician, you get about 50 hours of AMA Category 1 CME credit, which is a nice benefit. For the health coaches going through the training program, it's now accredited by the National Board of Health and Wellness Coaching. So graduates are going to meet the requirement to sit for the board exam and become board certified health coaches. So there's a lot of benefits to that, not just the certification, but also when it comes to things like insurance reimbursement. So it's a really robust program. If you're a physician, a nurse practitioner, a PA, or someone that just wants to be a health coach, it's open to all of those categories. There's the 6-month program that's kind of the full program. And then we also have just a fundamentals of precision medicine course, which is completely on your own. It's online. It's all asynchronous. You still get the 50 hours of AMA Category 1, but it's self-paced. And you still have access to the online community, but not all the synchronous lectures as well. So if you're interested in checking that out, go to wildhealth.com/education. And we'd love to have you as part of our next class.
One of our core values at Wild Health is to live wild. And when we say live wild, we mean a few things by that. And part of it is sort of this wild idea of healthcare, approaching healthcare in a way that is preventive-based rather than putting a Band-Aid on regular disease. And not only do we wear the shirt, which is what Matt's showing right now with his camera, to live wild, but we believe it means other things too, more than just having these wild ideas about the way healthcare should be or the way wellness should be approached, but also reconnecting with nature. And that's what we want to talk about today. We want to talk about something called rewilding. Matt, can you tell us a little bit about what rewilding is?
I have no idea what rewilding in itself means, but I think I understand. It is the term that I've heard a couple times, and so I think what you're referring to is what we think about, the other component of live wild, which has to do with nature and kind of wild as in wilderness as well. I think in general, while we really lean into the deep science approach and genomics and cutting edge stuff, the opposite end of that is a different type of wild. It's being in the wild, in nature. And we think disconnection from that is a big part of a lot of the problems that we have. And so while we want to use all the cutting edge tools we can in a pretty wild way, we also want to go to the opposite end of the spectrum. It's interesting. I've always felt like medicine is in this weird no man's land. On the one hand, it's behind like the cutting edge science. So we want to go out on a limb there. And it's also thrown away a lot of the old truths and kind of the connection to nature. So we want to kind of go backwards and forwards. So when you're talking about rewilding, I think what you mean and what people mean in general is just this reconnection to our wild selves, which I think is just, if I had to summarize it really quickly, it's already too late to be really quickly, I guess, at this point. But it's the process of, I think, reconnecting to those ancestral roots and really adopting practices and behaviors that are more in line with how our ancestors live. That's what I think kind of rewilding means to me. And it leads to better physical, mental, and emotional health. And I think a perfect example is like the paleo diet. That's what I think a lot of people think about when they think about rewilding.
Yeah, it's interesting that that really resonates with me about medicine, how it sort of lives in this no man's land. We think we're hot and in the science, and in reality, we're practicing medicine that's 15 to 20 years old, while at the same time we've completely abolished any ancestral knowledge or wisdom that humanity has acquired over the years because it's not quote unquote science, right? It's interesting how blind we are to obviously hundreds of thousands of millions of years of knowledge that the human race has created through our relationship with nature and to the wild. So just completely abolishing that out of our knowledge base or out of the database in general just makes absolutely no sense. So I think it's a really cool topic, one that I'm super excited to talk about.
Yeah, when you say we are doing that, yeah, just to clarify, you mean kind of medicine in general. Like we specifically in Wild Health are trying to do the opposite. That's really our kind of go. I think it would be probably most helpful, though, instead of talking high level, to talk about specific ways as well that we do that. So I mentioned already kind of the paleo diet. I think that's probably a good place to start is with foods in general. Like what does it look like to eat a wild diet? I have kind of some ideas. You want to talk about that at all, Mike? How you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe before we do that, what's the point of rewilding, of reconnecting with nature? I feel like you sort of hit on it a little bit, Matt, but maybe if we can talk about it a little bit more before we dive into the very like nitty gritty details of how you live a wild life, other than sounding like hip and cool and being wild or being different. What are the specifics around having a more wild lifestyle?
Yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward. It's we want better health. We want better physical, mental, and emotional health. And you also said a really good word. I think I want to kind of jump on what you said: reconnecting to nature. There's a really cool book. I think it's Johann Hari who wrote Lost Connections, and in it he talks about a lot of our ills, depression, anxiety, and mental health problems are from these lost connection to meaningful work, to social relationships. And right now we're talking about a lost connection to nature. So I think just reestablishing that connection, we want that because it leads to better physical, mental, and emotional health, which is what we're really after, kind of that whole health for a person.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've ever experienced this, Matt, but I've noticed, and maybe we'll get to this later in some of the specific details, but when I'm in nature more, I feel better. And so there's this notion of forest bathing, right? Which is a thing that I'm not a big fan of calling walking in the forest bathing, but whatever. So there's forest bathing, which, there have been scientific studies on that show that it actually improves people's mental health, taking walks in nature. Also, personally, I've noticed that when I sleep, when I'm camping, my HRV is higher. I generally feel more recovered. I get back from a camping trip, and despite the fact that I'm honestly like sleeping kind of poorly, sleeping on the ground, or been moving about all day, I come back and I just feel rejuvenated. I feel like a new version of myself. So I really think there's something to that sense of getting back into nature and how it sort of heals our ailments, not just in terms of mental health, but also physical health. I mean, talking about HRV and recovery. So there's clearly value here. I wish we had more data on it, but at least we have some to suggest that this is a real thing.
So, I think it's always good to have more data, but I would kind of challenge you a little bit there, Mike, in that I think we have a ton of data on that. It's really on Shinrin Yoku specifically in this kind of forest bathing. Like, and you mentioned kind of mental health. I think that's the obvious one because you can feel that. But in Japan, they've done a lot of studies on this, and they've shown things like there was a study. I actually pulled a few of these up. There was a study that showed forest environments reduce cortisol levels by 12%, lower average pulse, decreased blood pressure. There's the famous study of the gallbladder patients, and when post-surgery they randomized these gallbladder patients to have a window that's facing some trees and nature, and then a window that doesn't have anything. I think they were looking like at another building or no windows, and they recovered more quickly. There's interesting studies out of Japan, and people that live in areas with more nature in general have lower rates of cancer, like lower overall global mortality in general. So sure, the emotional component, but just actual hard outcomes, it makes a big difference. It's a really cool thing, similar to kind of sauna. If it was a pill, it would be a blockbuster pill. Just getting in nature makes you very physically healthy as well, not just emotionally.
Well, yeah, not to mention the mind-body connection, right? Like you heal the mind, you heal the body, sort of back and forth, and how interconnected all those things are. Definitely plays a role.
Yeah, I just found that the study I was looking for. There's two that I thought were really cool here. One on improved immune function with forest bathing. This was in Environmental Health and Preventive Medicine 2010. Participants who spent time in forest environments, they showed an increase of 50% in natural killer cell activity and elevated levels of anti-cancer proteins. So not like a direct outcomes study, but there was another one that showed reduced chronic diseases that was also published in Environmental Research in 2016. This was a systematic review, and they looked at people living in areas with the highest quintile of green vegetation, and they had 13% lower rate of mortality from cardiovascular disease, 34% lower rate of respiratory disease-related mortality, and a 22% lower rate of cancer mortality compared to those in the lowest quintile of kind of green vegetation in their areas. So some pretty big benefits. Obviously, tons of confounders, blah, 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 all that, but some evidence that it probably has very positive effects on your physical health too, maybe because of the emotional component, but whatever the reason, it seems like there's some really cool effects of just being in nature.
Cool effects without much potential downside, right? So this is one of those things, though, where I think we can get caught in the situation of, this is great if you live in a rural area, but there's a lot of people in this world who live in urban areas, and getting out into the wild is not necessarily super easy for them to do. So what are some practical things that we as humans can do on a daily basis to wild ourselves?
Yeah, and the interesting thing about being in nature too, there's actually a dose-dependent curve. So there's been shown some effects just from being outside for 30 minutes in a park. There's a really cool study looking at that. They did show bigger effects on patients who spend more time in nature, if you can kind of be out there for a whole day or then even a week. But just some time outside has a positive benefit. So, for example, I take all of my calls while walking outside when I can. So just very simple things like that. I remember when I used to work in the emergency department, I physically would just start to feel bad after about 2 hours of being in these windowless kind of basements that emergency departments usually are, and I'd have to go outside. And it was pretty incredible to feel that effect on myself. Now I'm not exposed to that, and so I'm trying to be outside as much as possible. But just going out for kind of 5 minutes at a time every hour or so, or whenever you can, when you're going to have a phone call, not a video call, just that in itself can make a big difference.
And I guess that's not the only way to get more wild in your life anyway. You can, for example, change the way you eat. Like you mentioned earlier, the paleo diet is an example of getting more wild. Talk a little bit about that if you don't mind.
Sure. So if we're talking about kind of being ancestral and eating a more natural diet in general, the paleo diet is about that in general. I don't want to talk specifically about the paleo diet, though. So I think the way that I would like to talk about this is similar to how we've mentioned before. I still think that Michael Pollan's description of eat whole foods is a really good one, in that he gives a definition of that, of if your great-great-grandmother would recognize it as food. So I think kind of the further back you can go and say, is this food 100 years ago or 200 years ago, the better off you are. You're going to be reducing intake of additives, preservatives, artificial sugars, things like that when you're eating that way. So just trying to think about eating. I talk to my kids and others about this: plants and animals, like that. not stuff that comes from a box that they have no idea where it comes from, but just plants and animals like our ancestors would. I think we can make a tremendous difference in our health if we just did that.
Yeah, and this is basically just another way of saying avoid processed food, right? Which is, something that we say all the time for health reasons, but now, and I guess we're still talking about it for health reasons. We're talking about rewilding yourself and living wild, but in a different way, in a connection way, as opposed to just, don't eat processed food because it's bad for your omega-6 levels. It's avoid processed food because it distracts your connection from the earth. And, the most obvious way to think about that for me is at least gardening, right? I don't know if you've ever experienced this, Matt, but like there's something about food that you grow yourself in that it just tastes different. It tastes better. It, you have more, you assign more value to the food. So not only are you getting something that is not processed, that you've grown yourself, you know where it comes from, you know the dirt that it's grown in, you know that it doesn't have pesticides, you know its value, but you also connect with it because you've grown it, right? There's really something special about that I think we lose by going to the grocery store, frankly, and buying food that we don't even know where it comes from. And you can even get a little bit of that if you don't have a garden, just from going to the farmer's market and actually meeting with and talking to the people that are growing your food or harvesting your food. And that connection leads to a greater depth of meaning in what you're eating, and I think offers a lot of value that it's sort of difficult to assign unless you actually go out and try it. It's a very subjective experience.
Well, and there have been studies on nutrient content and how healthy is a food when it comes to that kind of nutrient density. And organic food that is grown locally is more nutrient dense than food that is designed to just withstand long shipping and airline flights and things like that to make it to a grocery store without being ruined. So there is some scientific validity to that, but I think what you were referring to, though, also is you use that word connection again, and a connection to it. And again, I'll mention that the book by Johann Hari, again, Lost Connections. If anyone is interested, I think they should definitely check that out. But I think that connection, there's something else more than just the nutrient content. It's just the connection that you feel to it. And you said value as well. Just valuing it, you're going to probably eat it more slowly and enjoy it as well, and not just scarf it down because either you put a lot of work into it or someone you just met and know put a lot of work into it as well. How do you we're talking about kind of these big pillars, mental health, you talked about the forest bathing, we're talking about food. If we think about the other big kind of pillars, there's sleep and exercise. So what about exercise, Mike? How do you kind of incorporate this concept of rewilding or living wild in general into your exercise routine?
That one's pretty easy. Get outside as much as possible. I prefer exercise outside whenever it's possible, and that can look like walking, that can look like running, that can look like riding my bike. But getting outside in nature, it can also look like going to the gym. I mean, you can take gym equipment outside and literally use that equipment outside. There's no reason you can't, wheel your Concept 2 rower into the driveway and actually just be outside in the sunlight while you're using it. So that one for me feels pretty easy. There's probably other more nuanced ways to rewild your fitness and your activity, and that's sort of in coming up with new and creative ways to exercise. It reminds me of that time, I don't know if you remember this, but you and I did a workout one time over at a friend's land. He had a pond and a rower and I think a kettlebell. That's all he had. So we created this circuit where we rode on the rower, then carried the kettlebell over to the other end of the pond and jumped in the water and then swam back to the rower, and we were doing circuits like that. Just getting out and being creative with what you've got in nature is just so much fun and energizing. That's what comes to mind when I think about that.
Well, I love that you brought up that example. First off, the only thing I really remember from that is we were competing. We're pretty competitive, and I remember it was like a 20-something minute workout, all-out race. And you and I ended up tying exactly to the second, which was infuriating for both of us. But the reason why I like that you brought that, actually, I remember it very specifically, is because I think that's the perfect example of probably one of the most important points I'd like to make with this is combining and stacking natural things. So there was a lot of natural movement in that. Like we were swimming, we were carrying something heavy, we were moving our bodies in just over land. We weren't on a treadmill or anything, or moving artificial weights. We were kind of moving and going, and we were outside. In nature. We were actually in the forest, like deep in the forest. And then the last thing that we haven't touched on yet is kind of the social aspect. When I think about living wild too, I'm not just, I think the community aspect is something we don't think about. If we think about 1,000 years ago and people, or thousands of years ago, people living in kind of very close-knit tribes where they're doing everything together. Their activities outside may be natural movements and with others, whether they're gathering things or whether they're hunting. But we had really strong bonds, which we don't necessarily have now. So to combine all of those things, the social aspect, doing a workout together, natural movements outside, really working hard like we had to do a long time ago, that's where I think you really start getting the benefits, and that's really kind of living wild to me, is kind of combining as many of those as you can. And I remember too, we were barefoot, which there's a lot of really, people talk all the time about, there's a whole fad around kind of the barefoot and minimalist running, and there are some studies showing kind of stronger lower legs and feet when you do that. There's also grounding. People talk about grounding all the time, and they're buying these grounding mats and grounding things hooked to their mattress, so they're sleeping on grounding pads at night. But you also can just walk on the ground outside to get the benefits of that. So I love that example. It's a perfect example of how to combine several things to really live wild.
I really enjoy the tribal aspect that you brought up, and it's fun to think about exercise as like this tribal activity, right? And because it totally is, and it's quite obvious actually now that you sort of, especially in this, post CrossFit society or whatever that we have, where people have found the magic of exercising in large groups, doing the same thing, and competing or not competing, just cheering one another on, that creating that community. And I feel like we keep using the word community, which is interesting when we're talking about rewilding, but creating that community around exercise, whether it's CrossFit, whether it's another gym, whether it's running with friends and on the trails. There's something really special about that makes it all that much more beneficial, and it's because you're hitting more than one thing instead of just fitness, right? It's more than just running on a treadmill in the garage. You're not only are you getting that fitness, you're also getting that social connection, which is obviously where a large portion of the benefit is. And I think anyone who's ever drank the Kool-Aid can agree to that a big part of it is community. It makes me wonder how much of rewilding is actually just reconnecting with the human race than it is with just connecting with nature. Because when you start to break it down, it starts to feel like a lot of it is actually connecting with others as well.
Yeah, I don't think we were specifically thinking of things we'd be talking about connection in this podcast, but yeah, I mean, each of the things we've talked about, it's reconnecting to your food, it's reconnecting to your body and doing these natural movements, not the artificial and a movement of sitting all day, which most of us do. It's reconnecting with others. It's reconnecting with the earth and nature. Like connection is I think a really big part of the rewilding and getting back what we've lost. One of the things I mentioned earlier,
what about
just because it's
sleep,
a big pillar,
Matt?
Yeah, that's what I was getting ready to say. You asked me before I could ask you. So and it's interesting, I think this is an easy one because this is how I talk about sleep. Like when I give a talk on sleep, there's a difficulty with giving a talk on sleep is there's 1,000 molecules, it seems like. There's a ton of drugs, there's a ton of supplements, there's all kinds of devices. We talked about grounding, there's cooling mats, there's Oura rings, there's whoops, there's all these things you wear and measure and track. And you can get really deep into the technical components, but I really think that 90% of improvements in sleep could be done by just thinking about it from this natural and wild lens. So if you think about what a caveman or a cavewoman would do and how they would sleep, when you think about with sleep, there's temperature, there's light, there's sound, and there's timing as well. So if you think about a caveman sleeping in a cave or a cavewoman, You're going to bed when it gets dark. So you're going to bed and getting up at the same time each day. That's important. When you think about temperature in a cave, it's about 65, 66 degrees, which most of the studies show is a perfect temperature for sleeping. You think about light, there's no light. There's no artificial light. There's no light, period. It's very dark. When you think about sound, it's either completely quiet or there's some white noise with a little stream running through the cave. So if you just focused on those aspects of the light, with light, you want to either have eye shades or have blackout curtains. You don't want artificial light coming outside. With the sound, you don't want sirens going off. You want either white noise or silent. With temperature, when you're setting your temperature, think about the cave. Timing, you're going to bed early and consistently. You're not going to bed at midnight. That's supposed to be the middle of the night. So I think sleep is a perfect example of how so much of our health could be improved if we lived a little wilder when it came to sleep.
It's interesting, how much effort and money we put into these devices or these tools that we use to try to mimic that cave, right? There's $2,000 pads that you put on your mattress to make it cold. There's eye shades that you wear because every electronic in your room emits some amount of light, no matter what, right? Even like the fire alarms on the ceiling, right? Like literally everything in your room is emitting light, or if not that, the windows from the artificial light outside from the cars going by, the sound machines to drown out the urban noise. Like all of these things are just things that we're creating in order to recreate that cave experience, right? Which is sort of ironic and hilarious, to be honest, considering how much money and effort we put towards it. But those are the things that matter, because you're right. In reality, the more we mimic that cave, maybe not the stones or like the super hard floor, the more we mimic that cave, the better our sleep turns out to be, which is a really easy way to apply that logic.
Yeah, for sure. And before we started this, I looked up and there's a ton of studies on this. Each of the things that kind of we're talking about, how being more natural leads to a lot of really big benefits. But then the more I thought about it, I realized, like, I think people generally get the concept. I don't think we're telling anyone anything that they don't already know. I think what would be more helpful is actually giving some ideas, which you've been doing, about how you can, as I mentioned earlier, stack these. So we've already talked about a few examples, but maybe just like a few more examples of how you stack these, if you can think of any. I think that would be a good place to kind of leave people. Like you mentioned gardening. I think that's a perfect example of how you can stack this, especially if like you were doing it at an outdoor community garden. Like you're outside, you're exercising, you're doing natural movements, and you're in community, and you're doing something that leads to a whole food diet. So that's a perfect example of me how you stack multiple of these things at once to live wild. Are there any specific ones that come to mind for you that you do regularly?
Yeah, camping is a big one for me. Which is fairly obvious, I think, but not necessarily something that everybody does, and I think also undervalued. I mean, especially if you go, if we're talking about real camping, like backpacking, for example, you're out in nature, you're hiking, you're typically with people, although you can totally do it alone, and that has its own benefits. But I'm often with family or with friends, so we're talking, communicating, chatting, while moving a tent from one place to another, which is a decent amount of exercise, but being out in nature while you're doing those things. So you're getting the benefits of sleeping out under the stars. You're getting the benefits of all the grounding that you were talking about. You're getting the benefits of the forest bathing, of the exercise and activity. You're typically having to cook meals together and source. And if you really want to do it fun, you can actually forage all of your own food, which is maybe that's another level that you can give us some insight into, Matt. But I think an activity like a camping trip is a great way to reconnect. And I know, like I said, I know that's quite obvious, but when you really start to break it down, all the different aspects really do add up to something meaningful. What about you? Which way?
Yeah,
What are you doing on a regular basis to reconnect and wild yourself?
Yeah, you mentioned the foraging, which I think is a great one, and it's something that we don't really know much about, most of us anyway. And so, just about every family vacation that we go on, I'll drag the kids and my wife on a foraging hike in the local area, because every different area has different foods that are growing there naturally, and it's just a perfect example of combining all of the things that we just talked about. Also, as you were talking, I was thinking about my workout today versus 2 days ago. I'm in a hotel in Chicago right now, and I just got done with a long kind of 2 hour workout in the gym. You and I both we're training for this kind of 50K obstacle course race, which I really don't want to do, but I'm trying to like not die on it. So I ran on the treadmill, and what I've been doing is I'll run a mile and then I'll do like 10 pull-ups and 10 burpees or something like that, and to go for these long runs where I'm doing some other stuff as well. And it was so boring in the gym. It also, I started like really noticing some pain in like my calf, which I think is just from the repetitive nature of just being on this treadmill, very non-natural movement. And I compare that to over the weekend when I went for a long run and did this in the woods at my house, and run up hills and down hills and on trails, and I was doing pull-ups on the tree branches and the burpees in the grass and on the ground. And it was just a much more pleasant and interesting and varied experience. And I didn't have the same kind of calf problem from kind of the same repetitive, monotonous use of it. And it was such a better workout for my soul. And I think it was probably better for my body as well. But it was a really stark contrast between the two, and I think it's worth the effort. Like just getting a little bit creative in how you're going to combine these things, I think is totally worth the effort, because it's going to be really good for you physically, emotionally, but it's also going to be more fun. And I think that's a worthwhile goal in life as well, is to have more fun.
Yeah, live a little bit wilder, have a little bit more fun. Totally reasonable.
Yeah, and I think that's unless you have more, I think that's a good place to end. Live wilder and have more fun.
Yeah, that's pretty much motto for life. All right, well, thanks, Matt. Appreciate the conversation.
Thanks. I'm going to go outside. See ya.
Thanks so much for listening to the Wild Health Podcast. If you're a Wild Health patient, you might not know, but you have access to our referral program. This gets your friends and family 25% off Wild Health services. Just head to Clarity, and in the top right corner, you'll see Refer a Friend. Click there, and you'll be brought to a page with your referral code. Happy sharing.